Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back. Hello, everybody. This is Michael James. I'm your host for this edition of the Live from the Heartland show. I'm up here in Chicago's very blue and wonderful 49th Ward. And, usually at the beginning of each of our shows, we do what we call opening banter, which gives me an opportunity to run my mouth a little bit. It was originated by one of our producers, Thom Clark, who used to do very detailed scripts. And he is still a producer of the show. And we are very fortunate enough to have him today to be one of our 4 guests. We're going to have Thom Clark on talking about the year in review. We're going to have Lynn Orman talking music year in review, Adam James talking the year in review and sport. And we're going to bring back a segment from an earlier show recorded by our late great friend Dan McNeil, who does a wonderful poem. So stick around till the end of the show to hear all of that. As a kid growing up, I remember just loving the cold weather. I had a pond behind my house. It would freeze over. We'd have hockey games. We'd skate around. And then when I came to Chicago, I was very impressed that I would see these flat surfaces covered with ice and people playing hockey in parks, that kind of thing. Thom Clark, our first guest, he has a little something to say about that. So good morning to you, or good afternoon, wherever it may be. Hello, Thom. How are you doing?
Happy holidays, Michael, and all your listening and watching audience. It's great to be back on again. Ice skating was a big thrill of ours. My dad used to freeze a rink in our backyard, which was an old tennis court in the far back part of our large lot in the western suburbs. But Keystone Park nearby and other parks were all flooded. And in high school, I actually played hockey every Thursday morning. I was in the seminary high school, so we had Thursdays off. And we would rent Richland Commons in Oak Park for the whole morning for next to nothing because there was no one else around to skate. We had intramural hockey games going for 3 or 4 hours. It was a big part of growing up. Flash forward to today, there's been one winter since my 11-year-old grandson's been walking this earth when we might have been able to freeze our backyard for 4 days or 5 days without it thawing on us. I mean, my dad's backyard rink would be there from probably around Thanksgiving to the middle or end of February. And I think that's my biggest sign of global warming and climate change is that it's really hard to do that anymore unless you have pipes underneath the surface like we have over at Warren Park.
Well, another indicator of all of that, Thom, is to my understanding, the bait shop down at Montrose by the lake, which is usually closed up at this time of year, was open on Christmas Day.
It's the first time in years that Dale Bowman, who writes an outdoor column in the Sun-Times, really a fascinating column twice a week if you want to catch up on not just fishing and hunting, but a lot of other conservation stuff. And he's the one who pointed out that the bait shop is open as it's never been because A, it's so warm, B, the park district hasn't turned off the water. So the bait shop was open for business on Christmas, and probably given the weather this week, the rest of this week they'll be open because anglers always love to go out on the pier, at least at Montrose, if not elsewhere, and see what they can catch. And of course, the lake's not frozen over yet.
No, it isn't. Well, that's kind of our introduction to the year in review, and I believe we're going to start off with more on climate change. So you take it away.
Well, one of the big stories of the year, I believe, is that it will be the warmest the Earth has ever been since recorded time. And probably we'll be telling our grandkids and others that this was the last cool spring and fall. And to talk about 60-degree days in summer will probably also be an oddity, much less no snow on Christmas. Although this year, Easter comes early and we could have snow on Easter because that's the way the crazy weather patterns are going. And I think it's something that, a lot of us have talked about for years is we throw more carbon up into the atmosphere, but it's happened. And the recent international conference in Dubai, of all places, an oil capital, the COPS conference, barely came to a consensus about beginning to back off on fossil fuels. The host country actually threatened to veto the final statement if banning fossil fuels by 2030 ever came up in the final document. And I can't remember what the exact wording was, but they got around it, made some commitments that are voluntary, and that's been the problem with past agreements is that it's all voluntary, and the biggest polluters, the U.S., China, now India, um, used to be Europe, but they have converted so much to solar and wind that they're no longer the big offenders. Um, it's going to be really tough to get these big economies to actually slow down their use of fossil fuels and beef up wind and solar, as well as electrical batteries, um, to make that transition away from fossil fuels.
Tom, what about Third Act Illinois? They're doing
Well, there's
something with big banks. Is that related to climate change?
certainly is. Third Act is a national organization that's trying to organize seniors to leave some semblance of a decent earth behind for their grandkids. It's come up now for the third time. We're thinking of legacy now. And Third Act Illinois went from like 0 to 300 members this past year, organized by Peg Dublin, who's been a guest on Live from the Heartland in the past, and a lot of interesting North Side and Evanston and Skokie activists concerned about climate change. And one of their first big issues has been trying to stop investment in fossil fuel companies that the big banks are doing. And the approach is, as consumers, we've already had a couple of actions downtown at Chase. There's going to be a big announcement for a campaign that's already been underway to try to get Costco to drop Citibank sponsorship of their credit cards, because that's one of the biggest offenders is Citibank. The Wells Fargo and Bank of America are the other two bad guys as far as preserving some of the climate for our kids, because it is fossil fuels that spin off the most carbon. We probably can control the way agriculture produces methane that also contributes to the problem. But the one thing we could really start fixing more aggressively is our use of fossil fuels. And the sooner the better for trying to prevent us from going over the limit. Third Act Illinois, you can find on Facebook. My wife happens to be the editor of the newsletter, which is a very informative monthly group, and it's free to join. It's a very active, interesting group. It even has a book club. So Third Act Illinois is one group I want to plug tonight.
Well, we like that. I'm going to check them out more closely because it sounds like there'd be a lot of friendly senior citizens over there. And let's shift to war. Now, any year that we were doing a review, we could probably find some horrendous events taking place around the world. This year is really special in that negative, in a negative way. Tell us what's going on, Tom.
One only has to look at the stock price of Raytheon and the other defense material producers. They're having a field day with the stalemate in Ukraine, the outbreak of war in Gaza, the Sudan, which is below the headlines, continues unabated. And there are civil wars still going all around, supplied mostly by the big powers or third-party actors who get the armaments and bombs from the big powers. So I think this is one of the roughest years without a wholesale world war going on, that the arms industry is really having a heyday because of all these outbreaks of war. In the 6 or 7 decades I've been on this planet, I've never seen a single war solve the problem that it was originally fought over. Just is not a solution. It is something that is caught up in retribution and revenge. But military victories are very hard to gain. And the ultimate goal of most of the wars that happen are not ever resolved by how many bullets or bombs or drones you might have to deploy. It is negotiations, compromise, a really tough word for people to fathom, and in this era, even back here at home. So I think that next to the climate, the next big story facing the world are these outbreaks of war and how we can stop them.
There was a certain word that you said that led me to want to ask about the Pope at this time in history. We are our home base is Loyola, and it is a Catholic university. Sometimes I think we're a little irreverent, and I'm amazed that they let us keep being on the show. But all along the way, I've had as two of my producers and sometimes guests, both you and Katie Hogan, who know the Catholic Church real well. Tell us a little bit about the Pope and his actions in the last year.
Well, he's been very busy for 83 years old and has some health challenges. But to be honest, I pray for him every week when I go to church up in Evanston, because the longer he sticks around, I think the better the world will be for it. His comments, his wonderful writings and books are really followed by people, and he's had influence, particularly with young people. I don't know how many of them are going to start coming back to church, because there are many other challenges the institution of the Catholic Church and
I
other.
want them to vote.
Well, that's the biggest thing we need to get them to go to do.
Yeah.
But because of a world synod that this Pope has called, which many bishops have been opposed to because he's included other people for the first time, including women. About 25% of the participants in this recent synod, which is a year-long process that's still going on, were women who were able to vote on the final documents that are coming out. It's actually pretty revolutionary, although for some of us, he didn't go far enough. More recently, he has promulgated that it is legal and ethical for the church to bless gay couples. Uh, this was a fine line distinction that didn't quite cross into canon law. Without getting into the nitty gritty too much about that, he has not blessed gay couples or gay marriages per se, and he made it very clear these blessings should take place outside of any formal liturgical ceremony. But it's still a step forward in a very conservative, when it comes to matters of reproductive health, institution that the Catholic Church would be, its main leader would be taking that kind of a step that, of course, so many other congregations and synagogues and whatnot have done for years. Um, I don't think that Jesus, if he was still walking on this planet, would be concerned about who you're in love with. It's the fact that you are in love that we ought to bless. And I think that's what the pontiff has said. But to finish the Pope's great year, his Christmas Eve message took on the producers of weapons of war. And it's a phenomenal statement. If you want to read his Christmas message, it's all over the internet. It's a very inspiring opportunity for people to take some, some confidence that maybe we can start turning some of our warlike activity around. He really called out the makers of weapons.
I just remembered what the word was when you said he didn't go far enough, and then you used the word compromise. That was the word I was going to use leading into your talk about the Pope. But I like how he really came down on some right-wing popes and removed them from their position and kicked another guy out of his apartment in the Vatican. Anyhow, that was a good thing that happened this year. What's going on with the Pope? Another good thing has been the successes for unions and the amount of organizing that's going on. Share a little bit on that, Thom.
Well, I remember one of my mentors, the late Monsignor Jack Egan, who complained when he came back to Chicago from Notre Dame a couple of decades ago that there wasn't enough organizing going on. I was present when he pointed his finger at a local union leader and said, "When are you guys going to get some organizers back out in the streets? No wonder the unions have lost their influence." Well, the UAW showed, and I think the Actors Guild as well, and the Writers Union have shown that when you organize, you can get some stuff done. Even back here in Chicago, Columbia College is part-time faculty went on strike, the longest adjunct faculty strike that we know of in the country. And they finally got an agreement going into this holiday, hoping that will be voted on, and that real tough thing for students who had classes canceled and substitute teachers and all that. But the UAW, United Auto Workers, really showed some muster in going on strike against the big three all at once and doing selective walkouts that really put economic pressure on these owners who have been, along with their stockholders, making out like Flint. Remember, we bailed these companies out during the recession, and then now we find we can hardly afford new car prices. So I think the fact that the union said, we ought to be getting some of that money back that we gave up during the recession, and they ultimately won. It's a really phenomenal uh, victory, and it's clear the leadership of the UAW is now going to take on Tesla and other non-union companies.
Yeah, and over in I think Denmark or in a number of countries, the workers have really been hostile to Tesla, organized labor in Europe, which is a good story. Let's bring it closer to home now. There's a lot to talk about in Chicago. I mean, when you talk about labor union victories around the country, we've had a few here. We also have a new mayor who came in facing a lot of difficult situations. Um, and we have a very powerful former Irish uh, alderman who just got convicted. There's a lot about Chicago. Why don't you tell us what some of the things that you think are really important to remember about things going on in our beloved city over the past year?
Well, I guess I want to start with Alderman Burke, who's still Irish, by the way. But um, I think that the conviction, which surprised some people because they thought the feds had a weak case, but the feds have been convicting over the last couple of decades a lot of local politicians over fraud, racketeering, and bribery charges, and they have about a 94% success rate. So when they go after somebody, they really get the goods and put forward a good case that convinces the jury. The jury had 300 pages of instructions from the judge to wade through to come to their verdict. And it was, I think, a 17 count indictment. And Alderman Ed Burke got convicted on all counts. One of his co defendants got off, and another one got convicted on a couple of charges. But I have to think that Michael Madigan, whose trial is coming up perhaps later this year, has to be shaking in his skinny boots because they have a very similar kind of case against Madigan, but probably more in person witnesses that will be testifying against him. I think this is a sign that the Irish mafia of our political machine is really beginning to fade away as these convictions catch up on them. And to my mind, it took a long time to get him prosecuted, 5 years. That's what a good staff of lawyers will do for you. The pandemic played a little bit of a role in that because they knew they needed the big ceremonial courtroom in the Dirksen building to stage this thing because there was so much interest in it. And but I think he got his just desserts. The Ed Burke that I remember, despite everything else he did, was basically fleecing working families with the way he got property tax breaks to downtown corporations, including the former president's tower, a name that we shall not mention. Um, I mean, he became a wealthy man fleecing regular taxpayers by getting big time taxpayers tax breaks on their property taxes. And he got it to what he got convicted for, a quid pro quo kind of wink wink trade off. I also remember him, the two Eddies, Fast Eddie and Ed Burke, being the ones that held up a lot of Harold Washington's initiatives with the council wars that took place. And, that was probably one of the most overt racist times in our city's history. And yet that's what the machine was a huge racist, institutional racism machine. And I hope with the new progressively oriented city council, which Mayor Johnson does have a majority of support on most issues, will be a sign of changing that, and that we don't see too many of these current city council members caught up by the feds in future years.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the mayor and the big challenge at hand, which, he came in. It was a wonderful victory. A lot of us, I know all of us involved with the show, did some work for him. He's taken a few hits and he has really been hit hard uh, by an issue that is hitting the country hard. And that would be the number of people south of the border and everywhere else in the world coming to the south of the border and wanting to come to the U.S. To become, migrants is not really a great word, but newcomers, future citizens.
I
What
see them as
do you say
newcomers,
about
which
that?
is how most of us came here. We are all visitors from somewhere else in this world, going back 250 years. We threw out the local residents, um, people wonder why we have all this concern about immigration now, because we all came from somewhere else. And I think we sometimes forget that. Um, so
Some of us do.
I see them as newcomers who are victimized often by U.S. foreign policy in Central and South America going back several decades. And the economic ruin, as well as the outright fascism in some of those countries south of the border, have caused them to look for a better way of life. And they see the U.S., for all its faults, still the best bet to have that new life. And we have generally been a welcoming city. We accepted some 30,000 Ukrainians after that war broke out 2 years ago, and they were able to kind of assimilate into our existing culture and economic life, in part because there were already a lot of Ukrainians here. And so some of those support groups were already in place. Whereas Venezuelans, and we're talking about a lot of formerly highly educated middle class Venezuelans, have been making
Yes.
correct for thousands of miles with their families because they've been outright harassed, if not threatened with death, by the goon squads and whatnot that are operating out in that country, much like has happened in other parts of Central America. So there's an underlying reason why these folks are showing up at the border, and we really need a national and international solution to it. Um, uh, the governor of Texas thinks he's doing a cute one by sending people up here by bus and now plane to give blue state mayors like Brandon Johnson and the mayor of New York and the mayor of Denver, to mention a few, conniption fits over having to deal with what they see as a continuing issue on the border. And there's no doubt a lot of pressure on those border towns. I've talked a lot with people who have done work down there, and it's really an almost untenable situation. But we could be doing more, particularly if we had true immigration reform, which has been tried since back with the Bushes in office, and even they couldn't get the Republican Party to go along with some legitimate, reasonable immigration reforms. It's certainly not going to happen with the current Congress. So we're stuck with this overwhelming problem that the former mayor really didn't prepare the city very well for, and now Brandon Johnson has to cope with it. I think there's been some bad decisions by some of his young, lean staff. He's still staffing up, which has been one of the major criticisms, is that he hasn't brought enough of the right people on board quick enough. Um, One must keep in mind that he had about 2 weeks to prepare to take over the city's administration after winning his election, unlike Lori Lightfoot and other mayors before, who had generally, from primary time on, several months to prepare to take over the reins to City Hall. Um, Brandon, I was giving a lot of room to catch his breath and figure out what to do next. But that time clock is beginning to wear thin, particularly with the business community, because all they've seen are some pretty pro-labor victories in city council for low-wage workers, for tip workers, giving time off that wasn't necessarily in human resources personnel policies. So Chicago's a far more worker-friendly city in just a few months Brandon Johnson's been in office.
Thom Clark, we only have a couple of minutes left, and so I'm going to. Usually the sports come at the end, and we do have a sports section today at the end. But let me ask you about stadiums. The Bears are still messing around with where they're going to play in the future, and we also know that our soccer team has got a lease on on some property on public housing space, a 99-year lease. Talk about those two stadiums for watching soccer and football. Both.
Well, I'm not sure we have time to get into the soccer story. The Bears story is one where Brandon probably can't afford to lose the Bears, but I'm not sure it's going to end up being his decision. And there will be a lot of opposition to more buildings on the lakefront, which is clearly where McCaskey wants to go. He has several more years lease on the stadium he plays in now, which I always thought that was a mistake by Daley to do that kind of rehab at Soldier Field. There are plenty of other places downtown with good transportation where a stadium could be built, that it doesn't appear that that's where the Bears want to go. I don't know.
I always think they should go over by the old steel mills down there, But anyhow,
that has always been a problem place to go. And in the remaining time, there was a big brouhaha over how Dyke Stadium, I'm sorry, that's what the place is up
That's what
in.
it's called, Evanston, Northwestern football.
And while Northwestern's football has done a little better this year than people expected, the real opposition to a new stadium, which will be smaller, are the concerts they're now going to have. Although they lost some, the original number was 10 or 12. Now they promised to only have 6. I see that fading away over the next 10 years. They did get a big promise for a huge increase in the annual payments Northwestern makes to the city of Evanston, which they've always been cheapskates compared to other Ivy colleges who typically make payments in kind for the property taxes they don't pay, but they still get police and fire protection and ambulances and all that. So I think that the city of Evanston, Dan Biss is the one who made the deciding vote, decided that money was worth the trade-offs for having 6 concerts a year.
Thom Clark, you filled us in on a lot of things, and I'm really grateful for that. And I want to thank you. And I'm officially inviting you back to be on the show as well as helping to produce it.